Everyone. This is going to be a presentation about the Aleut languages. The Aleut people live on the very tip of the sea that divides Asia and America, right on the tip between Russia and America, on a group of islands, a very, very long island chain. One language for that whole island chain. So today we're going to talk about where is it spoken, both in the world, and we're going to talk a little bit about the region in which it's spoken. We're going to talk about Russian influence, the syntax. We're going to talk about its sound system, the pronouns, and in the second part of the series, we'll talk about verbs, and we will compare different Aleut dialects, and then we'll have a game. So just a few quick facts about the Aleut languages. So historically, they formed a long dialect continuum. This sort of works the way that Arabic works, or sort of maybe how the way that the Malaysian versus the Indonesian language, how it may move given its areas, and there's different dialect continuums in the world that work that way, where it changes from settlement to settlement. The language has a lot of things from Russian, mostly few syntax things, vocabulary, a lot of vocabulary, mostly modern vocabulary, things they didn't know before contact. And then the language is not in a good state right now. It's critically endangered. It has fewer than 200 speakers left. However, the language was pretty healthy up until relatively recently. Up until the Second World War, the language was pretty healthy. There were forced migrations, and I'm not sure, basically they were forced to work. And I'm not sure what the conditions of that were. I watched a documentary about that, and it's a sad story, but basically those events contributed to its further decline. And it is an agglutinative language, which basically means you add bits and pieces together to create sequences, which are essentially sentences, and depending on the sound that comes before it or after it, the certain sounds may change. Like you may change a glottal, one of those like guttural sounds to use a. I think that's actually a rule in one of the Aleut varieties. And the language is now dormant in Russia, but it is still spoken in the United States. Like I said, there's less than 200 speakers today in the language. So where is Aleut spoken? So this is a map here. So on the left side, you can see the northern part of Japan, the island of Sakhalin, and then you see Russia, and then you see that far eastern part of Russia that looks like a handle, and then you have Alaska, and on the far eastern end, you can see Vancouver, Canada, as well as Washington State. So in the middle of all this, you see Anchorage. If you go out to southwest Alaska all the way to where the mainland ends, there is an archipelago, and that archipelago stretches from there all the way to the very tip of Russia. Whether the Aleuts came from the mainland and settled on the Commander Islands and went all the way east, all the way to the Alaskan mainland, or whether they got there from the Alaskan mainland is unknown. However, that blue area is the historic geographic range of the language. It's basically the same language throughout the entire archipelago, with differences between dialects, the way that the evidence presents itself in the source I'm using. And this is a close-up, so in the other view you cannot see the islands like this, and so this is both the Russian portion and the American portion. So in the left end you have the Commander Islands, and then you go all the way up, and then that other end is the mainland. That's about to where it extends, and that's that there are different dialect groups and different island groups that have their own dialects. I have marked the map a little bit more detailed so I could explain the situation with the language. So the yellow portion is the Russian part. That variety is now dormant, aka extinct. We won't be discussing that here. The red portion, that gigantic area, is the maximum extent to which people may have been forcibly relocated for work, and during World War II to quote-unquote temporarily move them to protect against Japanese or whatever the reason from the military was at the time. And that red part all the way up to that green area, those are 2 islands, St. George and St. Paul. Those are known as the Pribilof Islands. That's where hundreds and hundreds of Aleut, if not thousands of Aleut, were moved during the war. There's still hundreds of them living there. Maybe there's around 1,000 of them today that live there, maybe give or take. And then that light blue portion, which may be a little hard to see since there's a small part that overlaps with the ends of the islands, that is the easternmost portion, or the easternmost point where the dialects are spoken. They go a little bit further up into the mainland, and that's about the extent of the Aleut language. Russian influence of the Aleut language. When the Russians colonized the Aleutian Islands, they had many Aleut learn the language because they needed to like prophesy the message, rather spread their Eastern Orthodoxy, or educate them in doing something, or have them work in the sealing industry or some other industry that extracted resources from that region. And there are a lot of words in Aleut that have Russian origins. Most of them are modern day terms or things that were not known before contact. And there have been a lot of things that have changed in some dialects. Other dialects are more conservative. For example, the use of a particle that is the same as Russian by, which in English would translate roughly as would, that is used in a couple of different dialects. The syntax was also impacted. What happened here was that in agglutinative languages, you have large strings of words that represent entire sentences. What happened in these dialects, in the dialects that were impacted by this, is that now you can have them read out more like a European language where you have spaces in between words. You can use this Russian word order, and you don't have to worry about changing. I imagine you still had to change rules because that was the language, but there were spaces in between where the words started and ended. Whereas that other way, you would just use copulas. You would just attach copulas to the ends and beginnings of each other to create your thoughts. And another really cool thing about this language is that we have sources that go all the way back to the late 1700s. So that we actually could explain how the language has changed a little bit and evolved in the last 300 years. So that's a very cool thing. So this is the sound inventory. It has a lot of sounds. It has a lot of sounds in this language, and there's a few sounds which are pretty unique. At least I have never even heard of sounds like this, or at least whenever they stand alone. So I'm going to play a few of them for you so you can hear what I mean.
Na, 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 ma, ma, sha, sha, hua, hua.
Bergsland was writing about the phonetics of the language and the phonology, and to represent a version of these sounds which are voiceless. They are not voiced. According to the chart that he used aspirated. He uses this initial H, and it appeared to me that this was to help whoever was reading it understand how these sounds could be pronounced without overcomplicating it. This initial H helps to devoice this consonant. So instead of saying if you say then you see that you don't feel that vibration on your throat. A lot of it is removed whenever you put an H before it, or whenever you put a ha before it. I found that interesting. And there are only 3 vowels. This reminds me of how Arabic, or at least classical Arabic, only has like 3 essential vowels. So there's a high unrounded U, and then you have a front unrounded E, and then you have a back unrounded ah. So in future videos, I really need to actually play these sounds so if you can actually hear the inventory here. And some varieties of Aleut may also have front low unrounded vowels as well. If you go back to the slide before, you see, for example, you have the voiceless labial plosive, the voice labial plosive, the P, the B, the F, and then you have the G, which is where the velar, or the voice velar plosive is. And then you also have, you have the voiced alveolar approximants, the R, and then you have the upside down R, and then you have that other R that doesn't have the little tip, So it's like ruh, and I don't know what the other one would be. But those sounds are from foreign influence. So they're from things from Russian. The P was used a lot with Russian words, and the V as well. Some dialects have more sounds than others, and others have sounds that some don't have. So you can see that these dialects had started diverging at the time that they were documented. And another interesting thing is that they have the k sound, the voiceless uvular stop, which is similar to the qaf sound in Arabic, which is also in the Inuit languages, which is actually, this is somewhat distantly related to that language, those Inuit languages. And then they have most of the throat sounds like h, h. So they have a lot of those. So the language has a very familiar phonology it can have a lot of familiarity to people that can speak European languages that have similar sounds that way. So on to the syntax. So a few facts about the syntax. This language is a subject, object, verb language which is shared across a wide span of Eastern Asia. So languages from Ainu to Japanese to Korean all the way to Turkish, and languages even in Europe and in between, such as even the Persian language has this as well. That's really cool. Clauses can use tons and tons of copulas. So you can join many copulas together. You could join, according to Bergsland, there have been up to 50 that were joined together on a phonograph in the early 1900s. And verbs can be marked for time and mode. This can get pretty complex, which is the reason I didn't put them in this presentation, because the verbs have all kinds of different modes, like optative and negative. Well, obviously negative is easy, but there's like a lot of things to consider. At the same time, it's like this is the first one where the language is mostly meant to be an agglutinative language, so it made more sense to split it out and talk about those as a separate thing where I could focus on them a little bit more. So syntax. So just to demonstrate that the verbs in this language go at the end of the sentence. In the first one up top here, you have Petra, which is Peter. Then you have this after it, which is that is an absolutive. So in ergative languages, the absolutive serves mostly as a nominative case, but I know that's not 100% true, but it's basically like the subject of the sentence, the first part, the main first part of the sentence. And then you have that next word, man, and then you have this relative. So I'm assuming this is kind of reminds me of an object or indirect object or something. And then you have this interesting one, which I don't understand the structure of this, but had is direction, followed by this which is a 3a. I'm not 100% sure about that one. And then you have this locative case. And then you have the verb to go, followed by the present, followed by a singular marker. You put the present tense after the stem of the verb in this language. And then the second example, you have hla, which is boy, and then you have I assume that's a plural marker, I'm not 100% sure about it. And then you have ada, which is father, a singular after that. So I assume this is how they would express the boy's father. And then you have the verb to work, followed by the present tense, again, the present tense marker, and then the singular pronouns. So in the Aleut language, there are singular, dual, and there are plural forms. So there are a few things to make note of here. So the absolutive case, as I mentioned before, is basically just marking the subject of a sentence. And there's a lot of redundancy with using the reflexive. So it kind of makes me think that it could be ergative language, but I'm not 100% sure if it is. Usually the absolutive case it's a feature of ergativity. The third person does not have its own standalone non-reflexive personal pronouns. So they use the demonstratives to express it. So this kind of reminds me of how many Eastern Asian languages, like Korean, doesn't really have because you would have to say like that man or that lady. Like you would have to say something like that to express he or she, which people don't really say that. It would probably work that way. Anan, if you add this to the end of if you add this on, I believe you can use this alone. You can also add it to the end of something else. this is used to emphasize the subject. In the dual, in the plural form, the relation could be reciprocal. So in the example here, even though this word is simply this tadidich, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is the third person plural standalone pronoun for they. So it just means they love or they are loving in the present tense. However, because they're using that standalone one right there, and you don't need to say that, but they put that there to like they mean they love each other. So that's an interesting feature. And then these are the pronouns. Explain this a little bit. You do have first, second, and third person. As I mentioned before, you have the singular, the dual, and the plural. And then the green is what's in common. So there's a separate set for self. But I just believe that's because that's a separate copula. But this is a basic copula that deals with forming pronouns in the language. So you don't have to use these, and oftentimes when you do, you're emphasizing something, or it has a separate meaning. So one thing that's very interesting is how the second and third person share a lot of singular things. They share a dual, they share all their dual forms, and they have one of the plural forms in common. So if you're trying to express dual, it's going to be, I imagine they have ways to do that because the third person it's not necessary to express the third person. So the second person, it's depending on the context and who's there, they know who they're referring to. And then I imagine if you really want to emphasize the third person singular, you could say team with the M at the end, and that would set you apart. But then I think of other dialects and how they may have changed the N's to M's because it gets pretty complex, which makes me think this language was already on its way to becoming more and more divergent dialects. You put the personal pronoun ending after this. So you could say ting, that's the ending for I. You can attach this also to the end of a noun, of a standalone noun. I mean, like my car, my hair, our language, stuff like that. Anaka or inaka. I believe more commonly inaka. This literally means self. And interesting thing about the translation is it seems like it carries redundancy if you translate it into English. For example, on the left side, one of the examples I have, I myself am talking with me. In English, there's no need to put with me. However, in Aleut, this is how you would say as you're talking to yourself. It seems like there's a lot more redundancy there. You have to double emphasize the pronoun ending. And then you have he wakes up by himself, or he wakes himself up. That could be another way you might say it. As I was mentioning earlier, the endings for this one are a lot more complex because with the third person, now they're going with the inakam, so they emphasize this M that they had in the last slide. You could see that was team as opposed to team. The team is something that's only used for the third person. It's not used for the second person at all. Then there's just a lot of different ones. Inak, imaking, inakating. So there's just a lot of ones to memorize, but you don't have to worry about dual for the most part. For the most part, dual is almost non-existent, and it's only in the third person, which is ironic because the third person is supposed to be the one that doesn't have a lot of reference. And as I was mentioning earlier, in this language, you can double the free form. The free form is the standalone form. I call it standalone form, personally. So the standalone form will be followed by the noun, and then you use the standalone pronoun by itself. And that's, at least in the Eastern Aleut dialect, it may be similar, it may be different other dialects. That's how they're expressing the possession. So in the first example, our ship, so tuman, our or us, and then this one, sunah, ship. And then if you want to do, I thought it was cool how you could just simply change the ha to a and then tuman, sunan, our ships, and change it to a plural like that. Very, 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 very cool. And then the second example here, ting, my, the first person singular, and then you have the word for spirit, ang, and then you have the first person singular ending, I, my spirit, something like that. And then the next example, you have ting, I again, and then they're adding this emphasis, this anan thing to the end of it. So nga, nganan, or anan, because there's a nga already in front of it. That's the emphasis, though, emphasizing your hair. I'm not sure if this is how everybody says it or if this is just an example. But imlini is hair, or imlin or imlini. And then ng is the pronoun suffix for the first person singular, meaning my hair. And then in this example, you have timas, which is a standalone word for hour, and then mas, which is an ending that you can put after a noun, and then you have umsu, which is tongue, or rather, this is one of the dialects for tongue, because this word can be slightly different. And then so timas, umsumas, our tongue. And then this is another way, I believe it may be more common to express, because the last one is specific to Eastern Aleut. This one is across the language, I believe, across the language distribution. This one, so you have mayu and you have ur. You simply just attach the pronoun ending after these. So for example, waya mayu, this is mine. So waya, demonstrative, basically this. And then you have mayu, the possession, belonging, and then you have belonging to me. And then the second example, you have ur, and then you have in, which if you do teen and you take the t off, so not urtin, urin. So I imagine there's a rule about the t being dropped and then just combining with it because it's a h sound. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I am digging into this language because it's a very, very interesting language to me. I've developed an attachment to this Aleut language. It's very cool. This one I'm not sure about. I know that akah can mean the negative marker not. However, I'm not sure how it changes for you. I'm not sure how that changes here. And then hinga, I assume that's a demonstrative, or that just refers to a demonstrative in the third person. So it, not 100% sure about it, but it means it is not yours. Anyway, this is another artist representation of another island here a couple hundred years ago. That's all we had time for. Thank everyone for watching the video. This means have a great day. Thank you in Aleut. Thank everyone for watching, and expect to see the second part of this come out very shortly.